Welcome back for Keeper of the Lost Cities Exile, chapters 6 through 10. Thank you so much for being here. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a chapter, and this is chapter 6.
Sophie fidgeted with the satin sash of her emerald green dress and wondered for the 10th time if she should change. It felt wrong to visit a cemetery in something other than black, but Adeline had told her the tradition was to wear green, the color of life. "You look beautiful," Grady said as he peeked his head around the door to her room. She smiled. "You don't look too bad yourself." "Thanks, but I truly hate these things." He tugged at his velvet green cloak as he stepped into the room. Whoever decided we should wear capes was an idiot. He didn't have to tell her. She hated the capes from the moment she'd seen the ridiculous school uniform with its stupid elbow-length monstrosity. But capes were the mark of nobility, and even though Grady and Adeline had tried to separate themselves from that life, the council would never let Grady fully resign. His ability as a mesmer was too rare and important. "Need help with yours?" Grady offered. Sophie nodded, and he grabbed the silky green cape from where she'd left it on her bed. Grady draped it across her shoulders and gathered the ends at the base of her neck. She reached for the blue halcyon clip she used for school, but Grady stopped her, holding out a yellow diamond-encrusted eagle, soaring with a ruby rose in its talons, identical to the brooch secured on his own cape. "The rune crest," Sophie whispered as he pinned it through the thin fabric. Her foxfire uniform bore the same seal over her heart, identifying her as part of Grady and Adeline's family. But having him give her the clasp, especially considering the day, made her feel choked up. Grady cleared his throat. "Are you sure you want to?" "I'm sure. They'd been doing this for 16 years. She wasn't going to let them do it alone anymore. Unless... Do you want me to go?" "We always want you with us, Sophie. I'm just afraid you don't realize how hard this will be." She reached for his hand, twining their fingers together. "I know, but we're family now, right?" "We definitely are." He pulled her in for a hug, stroking her hair as he whispered, "I love you." "I love you too." She thought about adding Dad at the end, but the word stuck to her tongue. "I guess we should probably get going. I've already informed Sandor that he's not coming with us." "He's not?" "Only elves are allowed near the Wanderlings. Even the counselors leave their bodyguards behind. So he's agreed to entrust you to our care for the next few hours." "Whoa, I can't believe you got him to agree to that." He protested. "A lot. But I reminded him of what I can do." The seriousness of his tone gave Sophie chills. She rarely thought about what being a mesmer really meant for Grady, but total mind control was definitely a powerful thing. "And I agreed to carry this, in case I lose my focus," he added quietly, removing a small silver weapon from an inner pocket of his cloak. Sophie felt all the blood drain from her face. Where did you get a melder? She'd never forget the way Dex had collapsed to the ground, paralyzed and seizing up after the kidnappers blasted him with one. Looking at the palm-sized gadget now, it was hard to imagine so much evil coming from a sleek, curved handle connected to a triangle of silver with a single button in the center. She hated seeing it in Grady's hand. Grady shoved it back into his cloak. "The council insisted I keep one in the house as a last resort. Don't worry, I have no plans to use it." She hoped not. Then again, no one ever planned to be attacked. "Where's Adeline?" she asked, changing the subject before she could relive any more nightmares. Shadows seeped into his features, and he closed his eyes a second longer than a blink. "Oh, I'll get her," Sophie offered. Grady didn't protest as she moved past him and headed down the curved staircase to the second floor. Even with the sunlight streaming through the crystal walls, the hallway leading left seemed to be shrouded in gloom. Sophie hurried to the end, where there were 3 narrow doors that were always closed. The center door was slightly ajar. "Adeline?" Sophie whispered, not wanting to startle her as she tiptoed into the quiet room. Sophie had only been in this room once in all the months she'd lived there, and only by accident, but it looked exactly the same. She suspected it had been exactly the same for the last 16 years, though the room felt dim and dusty, like someone desperately needed to flick on the crystal chandeliers or pull back the faded lacy curtains and let in some light. Adeline didn't say a word as Sophie crossed the soft carpet and sat next to her on the edge of the canopied bed. "Grady and I are ready whenever you are." Sophie's voice echoed through the silent room. Adeline swallowed as she nodded, then turned to face Sophie. She sucked in a breath when she spotted the brooch. "I don't have to wear it if you—" "No," Adeline stopped her from unfastening it. "You should wear it." "I'm sorry, I'm just surprised, because it makes you look even more like her." The words were strange, prickly things, and Sophie never knew what to do when Adeline said them. She knew Adeline meant it as a compliment, but Sophie couldn't help wishing that she didn't have to be the shadow of someone else, or worrying that the similarity had anything to do with why they adopted her. She followed Adeline's gaze to the framed photo on the desk across the room. A carefree Grady and Adeline stood with their arms around a slender blonde girl, Jolie, when she was about Sophie's age. Jolie had Grady's light hair and Adeline's bright turquoise eyes. She was striking and graceful and smiling, with rosy cheeks and gleaming white teeth. Sophie walked over to the floor-length dressing mirror in the corner and tried to see the resemblance. "My goodness, you have strange eyes," a high-pitched voice announced. Sophie whipped around. "Who's that?" "Vertina," Adeline gave a sad smile and made her way over to Sophie. "I guess you've never seen a spectral mirror before?" Sophie turned back to the mirror, gasping when she noticed the tiny face in the upper left side. A girl with shiny black hair, pale skin, and sapphire blue eyes. She looked like she was about 15, and she had a snotty, "I'm older and cooler than you" glare that Sophie had seen a lot of back in the human world when she was stuck as the 12-year-old high school senior. "What is it?" Sophie whispered. "It?" the tiny girl snapped, her pretty face twisting into a scowl. "Who are you calling it? You're the one with the freaky eyes." "Hey!" Sophie still wasn't totally comfortable with being the only elf with brown eyes, but she wasn't about to let some mirror insult her about it. "Now, Vertina," Adeline said, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "That was out of line." "Sorry." She didn't sound like she meant it, though. Sophie reached up and touched Vertina's face, half expecting it to feel like warm skin. All she felt was smooth, cold glass. "Get your smudgy fingers away from me," Vertina huffed, ducking under Sophie's hand. "It's bad enough I'm up here alone all the time, gathering dust like some common piece of furniture." She turned her tiny face away, her glassy eyes staring somewhere beyond them as she whispered, "I miss Jolie." "Me too," Adeline said, tears streaming down her cheeks. Sophie pulled Adeline back, and when they were far enough from the glass for their reflections to disappear, Vertina vanished. "What was that thing?" It took Adeline a second to answer. "Spectral mirrors help you get dressed and style your hair." "Is it alive?" "Just a clever bit of programming, a novelty that never caught on because people realized they didn't want their mirror to tell them that they looked tired or out of fashion. Jolie loved hers, though. They became friends. She even used to come back to visit Vertina on her rest weekends away from elite towers. They were that close." Her voice broke again. "Come on," Sophie said, leading her toward the door. "Grady's waiting for us." Adeline wiped her eyes, casting one last glance over her shoulder at the now silent mirror before she followed Sophie out into the hall. They climbed the stairs to the 4th floor at a crawl. Adeline seemed to be in no hurry to get where they were going, and scaling the stairs was always a challenge for Sophie, especially in the low heels she'd decided to try. She was 13 now. Seemed like the time to switch to a more mature footwear. If only she had the balance to pull them off. She tripped so badly on the last step that she would have fallen if it weren't for Grady's quick reflexes. "Still getting the hang of walking, huh?" he teased as he caught her with his free arm. His other hand held a red satchel, which he had handed to Adeline. "Hey, I can't be perfect all the time," Sophie retorted with a smile. "True enough." Grady held her hand as she climbed into the platform under the glittering chandelier in the center of the cupola. 500 intricately faceted crystals hung individually from the silver cord, forming a sparkling sphere. The Leapmaster 500. Adeline fidgeted with the satchel she'd slung over her shoulder, and Grady stared at the ceiling, neither seeming ready to give the command. Sophie cleared her throat. "Where exactly are we going?" A few seconds passed before Grady whispered, "The Wanderling Woods." The Leap Master sprang to life, twisting until a single crystal lowered enough to catch the sunlight streaming through the windows. Nobody moved toward the beam that refracted to the ground. Sophie could imagine them standing like this every year, too sad to step forward. But this year, she was there to help them.
Chapter 7.
Slowly,
Sophie had been in quiet
she pulled
places
them into
before,
the light.
but she'd never experienced anything like the silence of the Wanderling Woods. There was no chirping or tweeting, no branches creaking or rustling. It was like all sound, all life, had been sucked out of the scenery, leaving nothing but a thick, almost tangible emptiness. Even the silver pebbles didn't churn underfoot as she followed Grady and Adeline down the winding path, which seemed to glow as she moved, shining the way to the narrow gateway ahead. A vine with white, star-shaped flowers trailed up 2 gilded columns to an arched golden sign with looping intricate letters that spelled out, "Those who wander are not lost." "I've heard that before," Sophie said, mostly to herself. She was racking her brain, needing to be sure it was her own memory, not something someone put there. An image of a short poem flashed in her mind, and she stopped walking. "That's from The Lord of the Rings." "Well, not exactly, but it's close." "The Lord of the Rings?" Adeline repeated. "It's a series of human books, and it has elves in it. Elves that had some similarities to what elves really are, now that she thought about it." "Are the books older?" Grady asked. "I think Tolkien wrote them during the 1930s or 40s. That's back before the Human Assistance Program was banned." Grady smiled when her eyebrows shot up. "We used to send members of the nobility in disguise to try to teach humans our ways. The treaties had fallen apart, but we still hoped to guide them, bring them out of the darkness and into a new age of light. In fact, most of the great human innovations of the last few centuries happened under elven tutelage. Electricity, penicillin, chocolate cake. But too many of our gifts backfired, and a few decades ago the problems escalated to a point where the council had no choice but to terminate the program and ban all human contact." "What does that have to do with Lord of the Rings?" "Let's just say there were some who couldn't resist manipulating the legends about elves a bit." "So you're saying J.R.R. Tolkien met an elf and that's where he came up with some of the story?" "I wouldn't be surprised, though I'm sure he was only told bits and pieces. Did the books talk about wanderlings at all?" "I don't think so." "Then he didn't know where the statement came from." Grady motioned for her to follow him. Adeline trailed silently behind as they crossed under the arch and entered the woods. "These are the wanderlings," Grady whispered. It was unlike any forest Sophie had ever seen. The glowing path wound through a sea of carefully arranged trees, each one surrounded by meticulously groomed shrubs. No 2 trees were alike. Some were short and broad, others tall and slender. Some had graceful branches that swayed in silent breezes. Others looked stout and strong. There were leaves in every shape, size, and color. Some had flowers, one even had thorns. And at the base of each tree was a round white stone with a name carved in plain black letters. Grady led Sophie to the nearest tree, which reminded her of weeping willow, if weeping willows had red leaves and bloomed with thousands of tiny purple flowers. "Each wanderling's seed is coiled with a single hair from the one who's been lost," he explained. "When it sprouts, it absorbs their DNA, taking on some of the attributes of the life they now share, letting the lost live on. Those who wander are not lost." "Syra had straight auburn hair," Adeline whispered, running her hand through the swaying red leaves, and flecks of violet in her eyes. Soft purple petals showered them, and Sophie caught as many as she could, hating that they would wither on the ground. "Did you know her?" Grady brushed the bits of flower off his cape. "Not well. She was Prentice's wife." The petals slipped through Sophie's fingers. Prentice had been a keeper for the Black Swan, back before everyone knew that they were working against the real rebels.
Now he lived in exile, his mind shattered by the memory break the council had ordered, so they could find out what he was hiding. And the secret he'd refused to tell them was her, where they hid her, why they'd made her, who she was. His wife died not long after his mind had been shattered, lost her concentration during the light leap somehow, and faded away before anyone could save her, leaving Wiley, their only son, orphaned. Sophie had never met him. He was in the elite levels at Foxfire and lived in the secluded elite towers. But she wondered sometimes if he knew she existed, and how he felt about her if he did. She looked up, and a ray of sunshine caught her eye, sinking into her brain and pulsing with that same headache she kept getting. "You okay?" Grady asked as she rubbed her temples. "Sure." She focused on the forest, surprised to realize how many trees were there. There had to be at least 100, spread among the meandering hills and carefully manicured bushes. It seemed like a lot, but the Wanderling Woods was the elves' only graveyard. Could they really have only lost 100 elves in all the centuries they'd been alive? She reached for Grady and Adeline's hands. They held on tight and moved slowly down the path, their glassy eyes staring straight ahead. The path twisted through the quiet forest, leading them through patches of shadow and light until they rounded a large bend and entered a small sunlit clearing. A lump formed in Sophie's throat. Elevated on a small hill and silhouetted against the sky was a fragile-looking tree with pale bark, dark green leaves, slender limbs that fanned out toward the sun. Soft yellow leaves draped off the end of each bough like Spanish moss, making the tree elegant and wispy, and large blossoms the exact blue as Adeline's eyes blanketed the branches, filling the air with a scent like honey and berries and sugar. The graceful tree blocked the early afternoon sun as they approached. Sophie couldn't take her eyes off the inscription on the white stone marking the grave. Jolie Lucine Ruin. Without a word, Adeline opened the satchel she'd been carrying and removed a clear, fluted bottle filled with a deep purple liquid. "A special tonic the gnomes make," Grady explained. Adeline popped the cork and drizzled the thick syrup along the base of the tree. When the last of the liquid had drained, she smacked the bottle against the tree's trunk. The glass shattered into a million tiny flecks, sprinkling the wet grass. And as the sparkle-coated syrup sank into the ground, a bright green vine sprang from the dark soil and slowly coiled its way up the bark of Jolie's tree. Ruffling purple flowers bloomed along the stem, and every inch of the vine gleamed like it had been covered in glitter. Grady wiped his eyes as he took Adeline's hand. "The vine only lasts a few weeks, but it's the best gift we can give her. Plus this." Adeline's voice was barely audible as she gently pulled one of the branches down, revealing a silver charm bracelet tucked between the blossoms. She removed a tiny crystal star from her pocket and added it to the already full chain. "We gave her this bracelet when she started at Foxfire, and we bought her a new charm every year on the first day of school. She used to wear it every day, but we found it when they gave us her things from the elite towers. So we brought it here and give her a new charm every time we come." Sophie bit her lip, wondering if she should say something. But what? "I'm so sorry," was all she could come up with. "It's not your fault," Grady told her, squeezing her shoulder. But something in his tone had darkened. Adeline started to shake with sobs, and Grady pulled her against him, letting her cry on his shoulder. "I'll give you guys a minute," Sophie whispered, backing away. She'd thought she could help by being there, but nothing would ever make it less painful. And Jolie's loss was theirs. She didn't belong. She slipped quietly down the path, trying to remember which way would take her to the entrance. She'd wound through the trees for several minutes before she realized she didn't recognize any of them. Turning back didn't help, and as she turned around yet again and still didn't recognize anything, she was forced to admit she was lost. And she was alone. She'd been wishing for solitude since the kidnapping, but standing there by herself in the eerie silence felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. She wasn't about to stick around and find out what it was.
Running now, she cursed herself for wearing the stupid heels. She raced up the nearest hill, hoping she'd be high enough to get her bearings. But 2 small trees planted side by side at the crest distracted her. Saplings. Her blood turned to ice when she read the names carved into the white stone marks. Sophie Elizabeth Foster and Dexter Alvin Disney. Chapter 8. Pain shot up her arm as Sophie pinched her wrist, and she released the breath she'd been holding. She wasn't dead. She wasn't dreaming either, though this had all the makings of a nightmare. Her eyes turned to studying the tree, focusing on the one that was just slightly taller than the other. The pale trunk was scrawny and weak, but the tree still stood on its own. Golden, star-shaped leaves covering the skinny branches, with deep brown seed pods peppered among them. No flowers, just color, just a plain, basic tree. Her tree. She couldn't help feeling a little disappointed with it, especially compared to Dex's, which had a twisted trunk, spiky strawberry red leaves, and periwinkle berries. There was something so inherently Dex about it. Even without the marker, she could have guessed it was his grave. She had a grave. A glint of silver at the base of the thickest bough caught her eye, and she reached out with a shaky hand to unclasp a silver charm bracelet with 2 charms. An elephant covered in blue diamonds, and some sort of locket etched with intricate swirls. The scenery blurred as the world started to spin too fast, and she sank to the ground, burying her face between her knees. She counted each breath, trying not to throw her breakfast all over the grass. 63 breaths had passed before Grady's hushed voice shattered the silence. They kept the trees. Her head snapped up, but her eyes couldn't focus on the 2 people standing over her. She thought it was the sudden bright light, but then something wet streaked down her cheek. Grady and Adeline dropped to the ground beside her, strangling her with a hug. Sophie's tears soaked Grady's cape as Adeline rubbed her back. "We should have warned you," he said through a sigh. "I just didn't want to upset you if they weren't even here." Sophie tried to make her mouth ask any of the questions swelling inside her brain, but all she could choke out was, "How did they—" Adeline must have known what she meant, because she whispered, "We gave them a hair from the silver brush in your room." She swept a strand away from Sophie's cheek. "And we planted the seed at your funeral." Sophie closed her eyes, but it didn't stop her from imagining them standing on that hill, crying as they placed her seed in the ground, clinging to each other as they fastened her charm bracelet around the branch, planning to add to it each year. Was Dex's family there too? Who else came? Her mind ran through a list of names, and she shook the upsetting thought away. She forced herself to sit up, wiping her runny nose on the back of her hand. "But you know we're alive now. Why are they still here?" Grady touched the slender trunk of the tree. "Probably because the Wanderlings are living things. Would it be right to kill them simply because we planted them by mistake?" "I guess not," she mumbled. It wasn't the tree's fault that kidnappers tossed her registry pendant into the ocean and tricked everyone into believing she'd drowned. But it still gave her the creeps, knowing she had a grave. And not any grave. A tree mixed with her DNA, absorbing tiny parts of her as it grew and changed. Almost like a part of her had been stolen, somehow. Adeline held Sophie tighter as she shivered and whispered, "I'm so sorry." They were the same words Sophie had said to them at Jolie's grave, and they helped about as much. But if Grady and Adeline could be strong, so could she. She curled her hands into fists, and something metal cut into her palm. "Oh, I found this." She held out the charm bracelet. "Is it okay if I keep it?" Adeline covered her mouth and looked away. Grady cleared his throat. "Of course. We want you to have it. In fact, this is good, just in time for when you start your first full year at Foxfire. We'll have to get you a new charm." Sophie examined the charms they'd picked, smiling at the tiny blue diamond elephant, which must have been inspired by Ella. The locket turned out to be a small compass, rimmed with tiny diamonds. Loopy letters had been engraved on the side. "Let the past be your guide," Sophie read aloud. "What's that?" Adeline asked. "The inscription on the compass." "Compass?"
Adeline turned pale as Sophie held out the charm. "We didn't add that charm." Sophie felt her jaw drop as Grady snatched the bracelet and squinted at the inscription. "All I see is a jumble of old runes. You're sure you see a message?" He handed the bracelet back, and Sophie had to remind herself to breathe as she checked the inscription, which still read the same way. When she closed the locket and looked closer at the etchings, she understood why. Mixed with the intricate swirls of the black curve was a pointed end, like the curve of a bird's neck, ending in a beak. The sign of the swan. Chapter 9. "It's about time," Sophie whispered, even though her hands were shaking. She'd been waiting for the black swan to make contact ever since they'd revealed themselves with her rescue. Maybe they were finally going to explain why they'd made her and what they wanted her to do. It did feel strange knowing they were still watching her, though, still planting messages and clues in the shadows, waiting for her to find them. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see a face peeking through the trees. But the woods were as silent and empty as ever. Sophie studied the inscription again, which must have been written in their special cipher rune, the only runes she could read, thanks to the way the Black Swan trained her brain. "I thought you knew the Black Swan's code." She'd seen Grady looking through her scrolls with cipher runes tucked into the margins. Only a few scattered phrases. His voice turned dark, angry almost. "What does it say again?" "Let the past be your guide." She moved the compass in every direction, and the arrow pointed always north, just like it was supposed to. So the clue had to be the message itself. Couldn't they just say, "Meet us here and we'll explain everything"? Was that really so much to ask? "Put the charm down, Sophie," Grady ordered, so loud it made her jump. "What? Why?" "You're not taking another thing from them. If they want your help, they need to turn themselves into the council. Face up to their actions." "What actions?" Grady had been strange about the Black Swan, always getting angry or changing the subject whenever she brought them up, or asking about the council's search to find them. "You're acting like they're bad guys." "Grady," Adeline said, stopping him before he could reply, "today's not the day for this." Grady sighed, the pain in his eyes hurting Sophie's heart. Adeline was right. They were there to mourn their daughter, not talk about the hunt for the Black Swan. But "I'm keeping the charm," she mumbled, not looking at Grady. "It's not safe. It's just a charm, Grady," Adeline interrupted. "What are they going to do? Track her with it? They already know where we live." Sophie risked a glance at Grady, who looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he held out his hand. "Let me see it again." Sophie hesitated, wondering if he would give it back. She couldn't imagine Grady being unfair like that, though. So she handed it over, and Grady held it up to the light, squinting at the bracelet from every possible angle. "I suppose Adeline's right," he said through a sigh. "The charm's not dangerous, but the message is. You can do what you want with the compass, but don't you dare let them lead you around with that clue. You're not their puppet." "I know, but they also rescued me," she reminded him for what felt like the 100th time. "They're trying to help, so whatever this message means, I think we should figure it out." Grady pinched the bridge of his nose, like the conversation was giving him a headache. Several seconds of silence passed before Adeline spoke for him. "I think we should show it to Alden. See what he thinks we should do." "Works for me." Sophie stood, dusting the grass off of her wrinkled dress and pulling out her imparter. "Should I hail him and let him know we're coming to Everglen?" "We can't go right now," Adeline said quietly. "We still have to visit Brant, but maybe it's better if you don't." "No, I'm coming with you." All the information overloaded made her forget that there was another part to Grady and Adeline's annual morning tradition, visiting Jolie's fiancé. Grady and Adeline shared a look before Adeline reached for Sophie's hand. "Are you sure? Seeing Brant is the most upsetting part of this whole process. More upsetting than visiting their daughter's grave." "Brant's not himself anymore," Grady said, like he knew what she was thinking. "It's not easy to see him so broken." His face was as haunted as his tone, and Adeline looked just as pale. "I go where you go," she told them, sounding like Sandor, minus the squeaky voice. She hadn't been much help to them at Jolie's grave, but she wasn't letting them do this alone. Not anymore. Not ever again. "An elf lives here?" Sophie couldn't help asking as the scenery came into focus. Everything she'd seen in the elven world was enormous and made of
Jewels or crystals or glass with elaborate architecture and gold and silver accents. The square, windowless stone structure in front of them looked more like it belonged to a human. A poor, reclusive human with ugly taste in houses. Adeline fidgeted with the velvet satchel clutched in her white-knuckled hands. We had to move Brant somewhere he felt safe. The house didn't look safe. It looked cold and bleak. Even the land around it was nothing but jagged rocks and dark, dusty soil. Brant's afraid of fire now, as I'm sure you can understand, Grady said quietly. He couldn't sleep until we found him somewhere that wouldn't burn. All his furnishings are fireproof. We even had his clothes specially made. What about his family? Don't they help you guys take care of him? Grady shifted uncomfortably, and Adeline's eyes dropped to the ground. It's dangerous for them. Not that Brant's dangerous. He barely moves, just stares at the wall, mumbling to himself. But the guilt... Adeline's voice cracked, and she cleared her throat before she whispered, the guilt could break them apart. Grady took Adeline's hand. There's a reason violence and cruelty are unheard of in our world, Sophie. Our minds aren't capable of processing the guilt that comes with such atrocities. Or they aren't supposed to be, at least. It's why no one suspected kidnapping when you and Dex vanished. Why no one wanted to believe that the Everblaze was burning. Because if one of us were to do something like that, the guilt would splinter our minds and let the darkness seep through the cracks. But why would Brant's parents feel guilty? Alden had told her the fire was an accident. They shouldn't, but guilt is an insidious thing, especially mixed with severe grief. It slips inside, casting doubt, making you wonder if there was anything you could have done, anything you could have changed. Grady stared into the distance, and Sophie wondered if Brant's parents weren't the only ones wrestling with guilt. It wasn't your fault, she said quietly. I know. The anger in his tone was unmistakable, and he didn't look at her as he walked away. But he'd only got a few steps when he spun back to face her. Before we go inside, you have to promise that you will not, under any circumstances, try to read Brant's mind. I know the rules of telepathy. Telepaths had their own code of ethics to follow, rule number 1 of which was never read a mind without permission. It's more than that. Brant's sanity cracked during the fire. Watching the house burn, knowing Jolie was inside, knowing he couldn't save her. It was too much. Grady's voice vanished for a second, and he had to swallow to bring it back. The trauma and guilt broke part of him. He's not completely catatonic, like someone whose sanity is shattered, but reading Brant's mind is extremely dangerous. Promise me that you will not open your mind to his thoughts. I promise. He stared her down like he was searching for the truth in her words. Then he nodded, turning back toward the gray stone house and climbing the steps to the thick metal door. Icy wind stung Sophie's cheeks as she and Adeline followed. When they had joined his side, Grady pulled the chain that hung above them, and a low chime rumbled through the house, followed by an endless silence. They stood there so long, Sophie started to wonder if Brant was actually home. Then a deep voice called, "Come in." Chapter 10. Don't stare at his scars. Sophie repeated the command over and over, ordering herself to obey. She tried to focus on the gray walls with the glowing blue crystals set among the stones, or the 4 metal chairs, the only furniture in the room, that were bolted to the ground by large silver springs. But her eyes always returned to the warped, puckered dents on Brant's chin, or the red splotches and thin white lines that twisted and tangled their way up half of his cheek. He hacked a wheezing cough, covering his ruined mouth with his hand that was red and raw. "You brought a new person," he rasped when his throat had finally cleared. Grady wrapped an arm around her shoulder, and Sophie was surprised to feel that he was trembling. "Yes, this is Sophie. She lives with us at Havenfield now." Brant smiled, making his lip fold into the mottled lumps of flesh around it. Sophie dropped her eyes to the yellow-orange shirt he wore, with long floppy sleeves and a tie around the middle. It looked a bit like a bathrobe. Brant coughed again. "How very unexpected." Before anyone could reply, he pointed to the satchel Adeline clutched against her stomach. "Is that for me?" Adeline crossed the room to where Brant sat and placed the satchel in his lap. "You know I never forget." The fabric shredded as he tore into the sack the way a small child would rip open a present, revealing a round silver box. "Custard bursts!" Adeline smiled. "Chocolate, butterscotch, and lush berry. I made them this morning." Brant pried open the lid, pulling out a purple square puff that looked a bit like a colored marshmallow, and took a bite. Pink juice dribbled down the scar on his chin as he smacked his lips and stuffed the rest in his mouth. "Are custard bursts just the best thing you've ever tasted?" he asked Sophie, spitting bits of crumbs. Sophie had never heard of them, but she didn't want to admit it, so she just said, "Yeah." His smile faded to a frown. "You've never tried one, have you?" "No, Sophie started, but Adeline cut her off. "I only make them once a year." Brant didn't say anything, and he definitely didn't offer her one, as he closed the tin and tucked it back in the shreds of the bag. Sophie stared at her feet, counting the blisters peeking around the edges of her shoes. 7 separate welts had already formed, and she was sure there were more to come. But they stung less than knowing Adeline had a special treat she'd never shared with her. Brant hacked another wheezing cough, shattering the silence. "Are you sick?" Adeline asked. "Don't!" he shouted as she reached out like she wanted to check his forehead for a fever. He curled his legs into his chest and wrapped his arms around his legs, forming an impenetrable ball. "I'm fine." His voice sounded hoarse, though. "Sit," he ordered, motioning to the 3 empty chairs. "Tell me what's happened over the last year. Clearly there's been some changes." Sophie sank into a springy chair, surprised to discover it was actually comfortable. The metal was soft somehow, molding to her body like a cushion would, but it was cold. Or maybe the chill had more to do with the way Brant's pale eyes had focused on her again. They were more a gray than a blue, and they were framed with thick lashes the same jet black as his hair. She realized then that Brant should have been good-looking, but the fire had ruined him. "Don't stare at his scars." "I've seen you before," he murmured, still studying Sophie. "Have you?" He nodded as his eyes traced every inch of her face, finally settling on her neck. His metal tin of custard bursts clanged against the ground as he lunged for her. Sophie shrieked and tried to block him, but he pinned her shoulders to her chair with one arm while his other hand tore at her cape. "That's mine!" he shouted as Grady yanked him away and tossed him to the far side of the room. "What's gotten into you?" Grady yelled as Brant cowered in the corner, murmuring "mine" to his fist. Adeline rushed to Sophie, checking her for injuries. "Are you all right?" Sophie nodded, not quite able to speak yet. She kept one eye on Brant as she adjusted her clothes, frowning when she noticed something was missing. "He stole my family crest." Brant kissed his fisted palms, and Sophie noticed the tiniest speck of yellow sparkling, peeking through his fingers. "Mine," he said, laughing this time. "I guess he recognized Jolie's pin," Adeline mumbled, her eyes turning watery. "Brant, give it back," Grady ordered, stalking toward him. "It's okay, he can keep it," Sophie told Grady, as he grabbed Brant's hands, and Brant screamed and tried to shove him away. She seemed to be making everything worse by being there, and she didn't want that. Besides, Brant had known and loved Jolie in a way she never could. Jolie's pin belonged to him much more than it would ever belong to her. "Mine!" Brant shouted, laughing and kissing the jewel, before he slipped it into his pocket of his long cloak. His whole body relaxed when his treasure was safely tucked away, and his face twisted into an ugly smile. Adeline straightened up. "Maybe we should go." "No!" Brant shouted, coughing and shaking his head. When he met Sophie's eyes, he seemed to stay calm again. "Stay." "Really, I'm fine," Sophie promised, and after hesitating a second, Grady helped Brant settle back into his chair and handed him his tin of custard bursts. Adeline stayed next to Sophie, playing bodyguard. Brant coughed again, dry and hoarse. "Want me to conjure you some tea?" Adeline offered. "Nothing hot." He dragged out the last word into a desperate wail. Then the wail turned into a cackling laugh, and he rocked back and forth, rubbing his ruined chin.
Grady launched into a long update on everything that had been happening over the past year, but Sophie couldn't tell if Brant was actually listening. Mostly he stared at her with his damaged face, which made her want to look anywhere but at him. And yet, he held her gaze like a tractor beam. Adeline finally broke their staring contest when she mentioned Sylvanie. Brant's tin of custard bursts crashed to the ground again, and Sophie braced for another attack as Adeline jumped in front of her. But he simply stood, his eyes darting between the three of them. You found another alicorn. A female. Grady moved to Sophie's side, taking her hand. Sophie was the one to pick up Sylvanie's thoughts in the forest, and helped us bring her home. She'll be the one rehabilitating her, too. Brant walked toward the wall, gazing at the smooth stones like someone might gaze at the shadow out a window. So the timeline will be reset. He spun back toward them, his gray eyes sparkling as they met Sophie's. It's a turning point in our ever-changing world. Sure. The room fell into silence, and Sophie started to squirm, wondering how much longer they'd have to sit there in the cold, unsettled room with the cold, unsettling elf. Fortunately, Brant made it easy on them. I'm tired now, he mumbled, dropping to the hard floor and curling up like a baby. I need to rest. Sophie expected Grady and Adeline to help him into his bed. Instead, they got up and crouched beside him, squeezing his shoulder and telling him to sleep well. See you next year, Brant murmured through a yawn. He patted Jolie's pin in his pocket, like he needed to make sure it was there before he closed his eyes. By the time they made it to the door, Brant was already snoring. You're sure you're okay? Grady asked for the third time as they climbed the steps to her bedroom at Havenfield. Sophie forced a smile, hating that she'd gone to support them, and somehow ended up worrying them more. It was hard, like you said it would be. But I'm fine, I promise. I just want to go to bed. You're not going up there to try and figure out the Black Swan's clue, are you? Grady folded his arms across his chest. The sun was barely setting, and none of them had eaten dinner, but Sophie was ready for the emotional day to be over. They waited more than 3 weeks to contact me. They can wait another night. She leaned in to hug them goodnight, but Adeline pulled away. She closed her eyes and snapped her fingers, and a small plate filled with 4 pink, puffy squares appeared in her hand. Sophie jumped back a step. She wasn't sure she'd ever get used to Adeline's ability to pull things out of thin air, as Adeline held out the plate to her. I made these chocolate cherry custard bursts for you. I guess I should have given them to you earlier. Thank you, Sophie said, filling the silence when Adeline's voice trailed off. She picked up a piece, surprised when it felt smooth like a hard candy. But it was like biting into a sweet, sticky cloud filled with a fudgy chocolate cream and cherry goo. She had to slurp so it wouldn't run down her chin. She'd thought nothing could ever taste better than mallow melt. But now, she wasn't sure. Grady and Adeline laughed as she stuffed the rest into her mouth, puffing out her cheeks. They were Jolie's favorite, too, Adeline whispered. I guess that's why I don't like to make them. But if you like them, I could do it more often. Sophie could have eaten 1,000 of them, and she was sure she'd crave them every day. But she held up the plate to show the 3 she had left. These are enough. Adeline wrapped her arms around her. We'll see. They kissed her goodnight, and Sophie climbed the last flight of stairs, nodding to Sandor when she reached her bedroom door. All is well, he assured her, as his eyes lingered on her shoulder, like he could somehow see the bruise that was forming from where Brant restrained her. She swore goblins had a 6th sense for injuries, but he didn't ask, just stepped aside to let her pass. As soon as she set foot in her room, low music started playing. Human music. An old song she'd listened to hundreds of times growing up. Dex stopped by, Sandor explained behind her. He left something to cheer you up. Oh. Part of her hoped the Black Swan was making contact again. But when she spotted Iggy's cage, which had been moved from its small table against the wall of windows to the center of her bed, she forgot her disappointment. Iggy, or she assumed it was Iggy, was now a puff of pink frizzy curls. Dex must have fed the tiny imp one of his special hair-growing elixirs, which Iggy didn't seem to mind at all. He was having a lot of fun chasing his pink ringlets around and around Her iPod had been propped up against the cage, and when the song ended, Dex's face filled the screen. "Hey, Sophie," he said, flashing his dimpled grin. "I thought you might need a laugh after today, since I'm sure it wasn't easy." He looked down, biting his lip before he added, "My mom told me this morning that we might have trees there. Did you see them? That's kind of weird, don't you think? I mean, well, never mind. I guess you'll tell me about it if you saw them. And here's hoping mine captured my stunning good looks." He smiled again, though it looked a little sad. "Anyway, since school is starting soon, my mom wants me to stay home a little more, and my dad needs me to help him at the store, so I guess you're on your own with the Romanian for the next few days. Try not to let it eat you." He gave a goofy wave before the screen went black, and Sophie picked up the iPod, trying to figure out how he pulled off the trick. Dex was crazy for thinking technopathy wasn't cool. She set her custard bursts on the desk to finish later, changing into her pajamas and pulling her puffy pink imp out of his cage, placing him on her pillow before she settled into the bed. His fur felt softer than normal, and when she rumpled it, he started making his squeaky sound that reminded her of a purr. Iggy curled into a ball as she lowered the drapes, and within a few seconds, he was asleep. But it wasn't his motor snoring that filled her mind as she closed her eyes. It was Brant's raspy voice, hauntedly repeating over and over, "I've seen you before." He never told her where. That concludes Chapter 10, and I'll see you soon for more. Bye!